One of the greatest difficulties with which the modern historian has to contend is the enormous complexity of the facts which come under his notice. D'Alembert's suggestion that at the end of every century a selection of facts should be made and the rest burned, if it was really intended seriously, could not of course be entertained for a moment. A problem loses all its value when it becomes simplified, and the world would be all the poorer if the Sibyl of history burned her volumes. Besides, as Gibbon pointed out, a Montesquieu will detect in the most insignificant fact relations which the vulgar overlook. Nor can the scientific investigator of history isolate the particular elements which he desires to examine from disturbing and extraneous causes, as the experimental chemist can do, though sometimes, as in the case of lunatics' asylums and prisons, he is enabled to observe phenomena in a certain degree of isolation. So he is compelled either to use the deductive mode of arguing from general laws, or to employ the method of abstraction, which gives a fictitious isolation to phenomena never so isolated in actual existence. And this is exactly what Polybius has done, as well as Thucydides. For, as has been well remarked, there is in the works of these two writers a certain placid unity of type and motive. Whatever they write is penetrated through and through with a specific quality, a singleness and concentration of purpose, which we may contrast with the more comprehensive width, as manifested not merely in the modern mind, but also in Herodotus. Thucydides, regarding society as influenced entirely by political motives, took no account of forces of a different nature, and consequently his results, like those of most modern political economists, have to be modified largely. I mean particularly as regards to his sweeping denunciation of the complete moral decadence of Greek society during the Peloponnesian War, which, from what remains to us of Athenian literature, we know must have been completely exaggerated. Or rather, he is looking at men merely in their political dealings, and in politics the man who is personally honorable and refined will not scruple to do anything for his party, before they come to correspond with what we know was the actual state of fact. Similarly, Polybius will deal only with those forces which tended to bring the civilized world under the dominion of Rome, and in the Thucydidean spirit points out the want of picturesqueness and romance in his pages, which is the result of the abstract method, uniformity of structure, being careful also to tell us that his rejection of all other forces is essentially deliberate, and the result of a kind of preconceived theory, and by no means due to carelessness of any kind. Now, of the general value of the abstract method, and the legality of its employment in the sphere of history, this is perhaps not the suitable occasion for any discussion. It is, however, in all ways worthy of note that Polybius is not merely conscious of, but dwells with particular weight on, the fact which is usually urged as the strongest objection to the employment of the abstract method. I mean the conception of society as a sort of human organism, whose parts are indissolubly connected with one another, and all affected when one member is in any way agitated. This conception of the organic nature of society appears first in Plato and Aristotle, who apply it to cities. Polybius, as his wont is, expands it to be a general characteristic of all history. It is an idea of the very highest importance, especially to a man like Polybius, whose thoughts are continually turned toward the essential unity of history and the impossibility of isolation. Further, as regards the particular method of investigating that group of phenomena obtained for him by the abstract method, he will adopt, he tells us, neither the purely deductive nor the purely inductive mode, but the union of both. In other words, he formally adopts that method of analysis, upon the importance of which I have dwelled before. And lastly, while without doubt enormous simplicity in the elements under consideration is a result of the employment of abstract method, even with the limit thus obtained, a certain selection must be made, and a selection involves a theory. For the facts of life cannot be tabulated with as great ease as the color of birds and insects can be tabulated. Now Polybius points out that those phenomena partially are to be dwelt on, which may serve as a example or sample, and show the character of the tendencies of the age, as clearly as a single drop from a full cask will be enough to disclose the nature of the whole contents. This recognition of the importance of single facts, not in themselves, but because of the spirit they represent, is extremely scientific. For we know that from the single bone, or tooth even, the anatomist can recreate entirely the skeleton of the primeval horse, and the botanist tell the characters of the flora and fauna of a district from a single specimen. Regarding truth as the most divine thing in nature, the very eye and light of history without which it moves a blind thing, Polybius spared no pains in the acquisition of historical materials, or in the study of the sciences of politics and war, which he considered were so essential to the training of the scientific historian, and the labor he took is mirrored in the many ways in which he criticizes other authorities. There is something as a rule slightly contemptible about ancient criticism. The modern idea of the critic as the interpreter, the expounder of the beauty and excellence of the work he selects, seems quite unknown. Nothing can be more captious or unfair, for instance, than the method by which Aristotle criticized the ideal state of Plato in his ethical works, and the passages quoted by Polybius from Timaeus show that the latter historian fully deserved the punning name given to him. But in Polybius there is, I think, little of that bitterness and pettiness of spirit which characterizes most other writers, and an incidental story he tells of his relations with one of the historians whom he criticized shows that he was a man of great courtesy and refinement of taste, as indeed befitted one who had lived always in the society of those who were of great and noble birth. Now, as regards the character of the canons by which he criticizes the works of other authors, in the majority of cases he employs simply his own geographical and military knowledge, showing, for instance, the impossibility in the accounts given of Navis's march from Sparta simply by his acquaintance with the spots in question, or the inconsistency as those of the Battle of Issus, or of the accounts given by Ephorus of the battles of Leuctra and Mantinea. In the latter case, he says, if anyone will take the trouble to measure out the ground of the site of the battle and then test the maneuvers given, he will find out how inaccurate the accounts are. In other cases, he appeals to public documents, the importance of which he was always foremost in recognizing, showing, for instance, by a document in the public archives of Rhodes, how inaccurate were the accounts given of the Battle of Lade by Zeno and Antisthenes. Or he appeals to psychological probability, rejecting, for instance, the scandal of the scandalous stories told of Philip of Macedon, simply from the king's general greatness of character, and arguing that a boy so well educated and so respectably connected as Democritus could never have been guilty of that which evil rumor accused him. But the chief object of his literary censure is Timaeus, who had been so unsparing of his strictures on others. The general point which he makes against him, impugning his accuracy as a historian, is that he derived his knowledge of history not from the dangerous perils of a life of action, but in the secure indolence of a narrow scholastic life. There is indeed no point on which he is so vehement as this. A history, he says, written in a library, gives as lifeless and as inaccurate a picture of history as a painting which is copied not from a living animal but from a stuffed one. There is more difference, he says in another place, between the history of an eyewitness and that of one whose knowledge comes from books, that there is between the scenes of real life and the fictitious landscapes of theatrical scenery. Besides this, he enters into somewhat elaborate detailed criticism of passages where he thought Timaeus was following a wiring method and perverting truth, passages which it will be worth while to explain in detail. Timaeus, from the fact of there being a Roman custom to shoot a war horse on a stated day, argued back to the Trojan origin of that people. Polybius, on the other hand, points out that the interference is quite unwarrantable, because horses' sacrifices are ordinary institutions common to all barbarous tribes. Timaeus here, as was so common with Greek writers, is arguing back from some custom of the present to an historical event in the past. Polybius really is employing the comparative method, showing how the custom was an ordinary step in the civilization of every early people. In another place, he shows how illogical is the skepticism of Timaeus as regards the existence of the bull of Phalaris, simply by appealing to the statue of the bull, which was still to be seen in Carthage, pointing out how impossible it was on any other theory except that it belonged to Phalaris, to account for the presence in Carthage of a bull of this peculiar character, with a door between his shoulders. But one of the great points which he uses against this Sicilian historian is in reference to the question of the origin of the Locrian colony. In accordance with the received tradition on the subject, Aristotle had represented the Locrian colony as founded by some Parthenidae, or slaves' children as they were called, a statement which seems to have roused the indignation of Timaeus, who went to a good deal of trouble to confute this theory. He does so on the following grounds. First of all, he points out that in the ancient days the Greeks had no slaves at all, so the mention of them in the matter is an anachronism. And next, he declares that he was shown in the Greek city of Locris certain ancient inscriptions in which their relation to the Italian city was expressed in terms of the position between parent and child, which showed also that the mutual rights of citizenship were accorded to each city. Besides this, he appears to various questions of improbability as regards their international relationship, on which Polybius takes diametrically opposite grounds, which hardly call for discussion. And in favor of his own view, he urges 2 points more. First, that the Lacedaemonians, being allowed to furlough for the purpose of seeing their wives at home, it was unlikely that the Locrians should not have had the same privilege. And next, that the Italian Locrians knew nothing of the Aristotelian version and had, on the contrary, very severe laws against adulterers, runaway slaves, and the like. Now, most of these questions rest on more mere probability, which is always such a subjective canon that an appeal to it is rarely conclusive. I would note, however, as regards the inscriptions, which if genuine would of course have settled the matter, that Polybius looks on them as a mere invention on the part of Timaeus, who, he remarks, gives no details about them, though as a rule he is so over anxious to give chapter and verse for everything. A somewhat more interesting point is that where he attacks Timaeus for the introduction of fictitious species in his narrative, for on this one point Polybius seems to be far in advance of the opinions held by literary men on the subject not merely in his own day, but for centuries after.